wine, cider, or mead? Does it matter? Does the name really make a difference? So lately people have been asking, and I actually had somebody suggest some naming conventions. Why are things called what they're called? Like, how do I know the difference between a cider and a mead and a wine? And, is it a melomel? Is it an acerglyn? Is it this? Is it that? And I'm here to tell you one thing. It just doesn't matter. What you call it really isn't all that important. It doesn't change what it is. But some basic ideas, just to give you an idea. If you were to take apple juice, just straight apple juice, whether it's your own juiced apples that you got from anywhere and juiced them yourself, or apple juice in the store, and then you fermented that without adding any other sugars to it or anything, well, not anything, but any other sugars to it, then that is cider. Hard cider for those of us in the United States. I just call it cider because I try to be more European. I don't know. But at that point, you start to go, but what if I made it with blueberries or strawberries? To me, you know what? For the sake of simplicity, it'd still be a cider. I still think that's a cider. I'm not right, okay? That's not correct. But to me, that's still kind of a cider. Could you mix apple and, say, blueberry? Of course you can. And then you just made an apple blueberry cider, in my opinion. Because I think calling it apple cider is the proper way. So that way you'd say blueberry cider, apple cider, strawberry cider, whatever it is, and you got it. By the way, if you're curious what this lovely brown liquid in my glass is, it is my spiced methylene. Yeah, that's right. Oh, it's still an 11. It's just incredible. Absolutely fantastic. If you have the opportunity to make a spiced methylene, by all means, please do it. Anyway, so that is cider. Now, if you took that same cider, must, wort, whatever you want to call it, it's actually a must because it's more like a wine, and you were to add some sugar to it. It could be brown sugar. It could be regular white sugar. It could even be agave. It could be maple syrup. It could be all those kind of sweeteners, just not honey. Sort of. There's a caveat. Then you would have wine because you'd be making it a little higher ABV. We actually did a hard cider video on our channel that's actually apple wine, not apple cider. So one of these days we'll get around to making another apple cider video just to show you how simple it can actually be. But that's the main difference between cider and wine, is just the ABV, really. I mean, to me, they're the same thing. Now, some people will say it's not wine if it's not grapes. That used to be true, but it's generally accepted today that, if you fermented any kind of fruit or juices or spices or herbs or anything, it's wine. What are we going to call it otherwise? I mean, come on. Now there's country wines and things like that, but it still has wine in the name. Why do we have all these naming conventions in the first place? Legality, laws, rules, because back in the day, they could tax things differently if it was this versus if it was this. So that's where a lot of that comes from. Pardon me while I kill a mosquito. This is still Florida after all. So a lot of that comes from ye olden days when taxes on various liquors and alcohols were different based on what they were or what they contained. That's how a lot of what we know as wines, beers, and things like that today got to be what they are, is because of rules, mongering, taxation, all that kind of thing. Not fun, but that's how it is. Now, when it comes to mead, if we were to take that apple cider that we made, forget the sugar that we added, and use honey instead. But as long as the honey becomes more fermentable than the apple cider, what I mean by that is we'd have to take a gravity reading. You have to have a gravity reading at this point to know for certain. But if you were to take honey and add it to apple cider and ferment that, you would be okay to call that mead. it'd be fine. And that's called a cider, by the way. An apple mead is a cider. But technically, you want to have at least 50% of the fermentables be from honey. What that means is if you took a gravity reading and it was 50 points was the apple juice and only 30 points came from honey, it's technically not a mead yet. But if you were to add a little bit more honey and got that up to 1.100, now you're just at the halfway point. I'd call that safe to say that's a mead. So that's the main difference between mead, wine, and cider. But like I said, the names really aren't that crucial to me. It's more, why do we have to put a name on it at all? Well, if you hand something to someone, say, here, drink this. They ask you what it is. If you say it's a mead, well, it better be a mead. If you say it's a wine, it better be a wine. And if you say it's a cider, it better be a cider. If you handed me something that was actually a mead and called it a cider, I might be a little curious as to why you called it a mead. If you handed me something that's a cider and called it a mead, I might be curious too. But here's the funny thing. From a very, very, very technical standpoint, they're all wine because they're all fermented beverages that fall into that category. Beer is actually a different thing. It's done in a different way. It uses enzymes to extract the sugars from the starches, that sort of thing. So it's totally different. But if you really think about it, take juice of any kind or a fermentable sugar like table sugar, brown sugar, agave, maple, honey, and ferment it, you make wine. In low enough ABV, you made cider. And if you use enough honey, you made mead. Mead is a special thing. It gets its own name. It gets its own place in history. But realistically, to me, it still falls under the category of a wine. That's why a lot of people actually call it honey wine. In many places, it's not called mead. It's called honey wine. And I'm okay with all of that. Usually I'm a stickler about certain things, but this is one of those things that it's just not that critical to me. I want it to be accurate in what it's called so I can describe it to others. But at the same token, it doesn't have to be this super intense, critical thing that we get so bogged down in the rules that we forget to do something like this. Enjoy your brew. That's what this is about. It's not about, well, is this a metheglin? Is this an acerglin? Is this a mead? Is this a wine? Yes, it is. It's what you want it to be for the most part, as long as you're more or less accurate. Like you don't want to call a metheglin, if you mix blueberry and honey together, you don't want to call that a metheglin because it's not a metheglin. That's a melomel, by the way. Fruit mead is a melomel. Spice mead, like spices, herbs, that is a metheglin. This is a metheglin. There's no fruit in it. It's allspice, cinnamon, and a couple other spices that I can't remember right now. But that's what's in this, and honey. Had I made this with something other than honey, it'd be wine. It wouldn't be a metheglin anymore. It'd be a spiced wine. Had I made it with apple juice, it'd be spiced cider. So you see, all these things are actually interconnected, and much of the processes used to make them are roughly the same. Now, a cider is going to ferment a lot faster and finish out a lot faster than, say, a wine or a mead would, but they're still essentially the same thing. So before we get all bogged down in names and everything, just remember, try to be accurate if you can, but don't get crazy about it. And at the end of the day, it's all about this, drinking your brew and enjoying it. That's the key. Enjoy the hobby, have fun while you're doing it. And hey, if you like this video, look up there. There's another one up there. You might like that one too. Have a great day, guys.